Welcome back, Biomonsters. Today we're going to be asking ourselves, what is science and what is science not? So by the end of today's lecture, you should be able to, when approached with a specific topic, problem, or question, be able to determine whether or not it's within the scope of science to solve. So let's go ahead and dive in. All right, so the first thing that we want to discuss is this idea that science has limits. This is really important. Believe it or not, science can't be used to solve every single problem that could possibly exist in the universe. It does have some limits. Now, it doesn't mean that science can't be used to do a lot, because science can be used to solve a lot of problems. But for our purposes today, we want to figure out where those limitations are, what they are, and then be able to determine whether or not science can be applied to a specific problem. So our goal today is to figure out what these limits are and to be able to identify them. So let's go ahead and start talking about what some of these limitations actually look like. So if you look on the screen, you'll notice that it says science can only deal with things that can either be directly or indirectly perceived through the senses. I want to focus our attention on these three terms. So I'm going to go ahead and number them. I want you to do the same thing on your paper. The first thing that I'm going to do is focus on number 3. So this idea of senses. Now, you guys may remember from your time in elementary school learning about the senses that there are a total of 5. There are actually 6, but for our class, we're going to focus on 5. So let's go ahead and write down what those 5 senses are. So our first sense, and it doesn't have to be in any specific order, but I'm going to go ahead and say we're going to focus with our eyes first. So sight is our first sense, being able to see. The next thing that we have, and again, they can go in any order, it doesn't have to be in the specific order, I'm going to go with our nose, what we're able to smell. So being able to see or sight, being able to smell is our second sense. Our third sense, let's go with something tactile, being able to touch something, so a sense of touch. So we have sight, smell, touch, those are 3. We're looking for 2 more. So our fourth one, let's go ahead and point at our ears, and our ears allow us to hear. So a sense of hearing, or being able to hear, would be our fourth sense. And our fifth and final sense, outside of being able to see, smell, touch, hear, we can also taste. So these are our 5 senses. And these 5 senses are really important because these are the senses that we use to be able to directly or indirectly figure out what's going on around us. Now, the limits associated with science are related to these 5 senses. Science can only deal with things that allow us to see them, smell them, touch them, hear them, or taste them, or any combination of those 5 things. So something else to remember is that items that cannot be perceived by the senses cannot be dealt with by science. So this is really important. Let's go ahead and put a star next to it in our notes. If we can't use our 5 senses to perceive it, to get a sense that it's going on around us, science cannot be used to address it. So if it's outside of our 5 senses, it's outside of the realm of science, or it's outside the limits that are associated with science. Now we've come to our first stop and jot. Go ahead and pause the video and answer the question on your Cornell notes. When you think you have the right answer, call your teacher over to check your answer for correctness. So here are your directions for what's next on your Cornell notes. For each of the items that you see listed in the chart on your paper, I want you to decide if it can be studied by science or if it cannot be studied by science. And then I want you to put an appropriate check mark in the box associated with that thing. So to get us started, we're going to go ahead and do a couple. Let's go ahead and do the first 4 together. And then once we do the first 4, the rest will be up to you to finish. So let's look at our first one, earthquakes. Can science study this, or can it not be studied by science? Now again, to think about this question, we have to think about what the limits are. And our limits that we apply to science is whether or not it can be directly or indirectly perceived by our 5 senses. So in thinking about an earthquake, can you feel an earthquake? Absolutely. Can you see an earthquake? Can you see things shaking around you? Absolutely. Can you hear an earthquake? So if things are shaking, does it make noise? Absolutely. So it seems to me that not only can we use one sense to determine whether or not, or to perceive directly or indirectly whether or not an earthquake is taking place, we can use multiple senses. So I'm going to go ahead and put an X underneath where it says can be. Next up are viruses. When thinking about a virus, we need to ask ourselves, can we use one of our five senses or a combination of our five senses in order to directly or indirectly perceive that it's around us or that it is actually existing? And so if we think about this, we can actually use a microscope to see viruses so we can see it. The answer to whether or not viruses can be studied by science or cannot be studied, the answer should be can be, because we know that we can either directly or indirectly use our senses in order to perceive it. Number 3, angels. Can angels be studied by science or can they not be studied by science? Can we directly or indirectly use either one or a combination of our five senses in order to prove their existence? And the answer is that that cannot be done, not directly and also not indirectly. So angels are outside of the realm of science, so we can't study angels using our scientific understanding of the world. And let's go ahead and jump in and do our last one together, cells. Now, many of you guys already know that cells are the basic unit of life that make up living things. And so if you're looking at me on your computer screen, you know that at some point when I film this, that you're seeing me because I'm a big mass of cells arranged in a specific way. So we know that you can see me. And if you're capable of hearing me, you know that cells are rubbing together that make up my vocal cords, and that's what's generating the sound that you hear. So you can also hear me. You can either directly or indirectly perceive me. And so that means that science can be used in order to study me or study cells. All right, so we've done the first 4 together. Now that those first 4 are done, we've come to our next stop and jot. Go ahead and pause the video. Call your teacher over when you think that you have the right answer to check it for correctness. Now that we've talked about what the generic limits of science are, let's go ahead and create a really good concrete class rule that we're going to apply whenever we're trying to figure out whether or not science can be used to address a particular issue that's going on around us. We mentioned something about the 5 senses. So let's go ahead and write that down so that we can remember it, because that's really important. We need to come up with a really tight class rule that will help us remember that the 5 senses have to be used in order to be able to determine whether or not something could be studied by science. So I think the best way to do this is to come up with a statement that incorporates our 5 senses, and you guys should already know what those 5 senses are because we talked about them previously. So our class rule is going to be, in order to use science to study, and we're just going to say something because that's going to be our placeholder for whatever it is that we're actually interested in studying. So in order to use science to study things in the natural world, so the world around us, we must be able to directly, and this is key, or indirectly perceive it using one or more of our 5 senses. All right, we've come to our next stop and jot. Go ahead and pause the video and answer the question on your Cornell notes. When you think you have the right answer, call your teacher over to check it for correctness. So now that you're ready to start your second activity, I need you to raise your hand, call your teacher over, and get your envelope for your sorting activity. The directions for your sorting activity are found on your paper. So for right now, go ahead and pause the video and claim your envelope. All right, now that you've finished your sorting activity, let's go ahead and see whether or not you sorted correctly. So the first thing that we're going to bring up is based on faith. So the question is science based on faith or is science not based on faith? Well, the very definition of faith means that there's no evidence. And without evidence, that means that we don't have either direct or indirect use of our 5 senses. And thinking back to our class rule, we know that if we're not using our 5 senses, that it's not a part of science. So science is not based on faith. So that should be on the right-hand side of your day sheet. Make sure you go ahead and write that down and double check and see whether or not you sorted it correctly on your table. All right. The next thing that we need to ask ourselves is whether or not science is certain. Now, this idea of certain simply means that science is never wrong. So as soon as we come up with an idea in science, that is the concrete truth for all of eternity. Well, many of you have probably figured out that there are lots of theories that have come through and scientific understanding that's come through that's no longer considered correct in today's world based on the new technology that we have and our new understanding. So based on that, you should have probably determined that science in fact is not certain. So the next term that we need to ask ourselves is whether or not science is testable. Now, testable is a fancy word that has a lot in common with this word, experiment. An experiment is a test. So we need to ask ourselves, do we do experiments or do we do tests in science? And you guys should already know that absolutely science is indeed testable, and science, our understanding of science, is based on these tests that we do. Our next topic is this concept of rigidity, whether or not something is really rigid. And if something is really rigid, it means that it's inflexible. It never changes. So obviously science does change. It changes based on new understanding, new techniques, and new technology. So instead of saying that science is rigid, we're going to say that science is not rigid. It's time for our next term. Our next term is based on experimentation. Well, we know that there is a connection between experimentation and this idea of something being testable. And I told you that testable means experiment. A test or an experiment are the same thing. So based on that, we know that science is absolutely 100% based on experimentation, so it should be on the left-hand side of your chart. Here comes our next concept, whether or not science is open to change. Now this, being open to change, is the opposite of these two terms. So being open to change is the opposite of being certain, and being open to change is the opposite of being rigid. So we know that science does change. We know that science isn't inflexible. So we also know that science is open to change, so we're going to go ahead and see that on the left-hand side. So make sure you write that down in the correct spot on your day sheet. Here comes our next topic, whether or not science is repeatable. If it can't be reproduced by other scientists, it means that there was some sort of flaw or anomaly that happened in the experimentation process, and that data is not actually valid. It's not useful. We can't use it. So science is absolutely 100% repeatable. Here comes our next term, whether or not science is absolute. Well, this term absolute means the same thing as certain and means the same thing as rigid. Science does change. In fact, it changes all the time based on new data that we collect as we do more and more experimentation, as we get better and better equipment and better technology. So that's going to be on the right-hand side of your chart. Next up, science is or science is not a search for understanding. Absolutely, science is definitely a search for understanding. Here comes our next one. Science is or science is not measurable. In fact, these measurables are the data that we actually use in order to search for understanding around a specific subject, topic, or question that we might have. So science is absolutely measurable. That's going to go on the left-hand side of your chart. Here comes our next term. Science is or science is not able to solve all problems. But the reality is that science has limits. That was our big ticket item that we talked about at the very beginning of our Cornell notes. And if science is indeed limited, that means that science is not able to solve all problems. And in fact, you guys should know that science can only solve problems if those problems can be perceived directly or indirectly by one or more of our five senses. Here comes our next one. Science is not limited to the natural world. So obviously, in order for science to be able to study it, in order for us to be able to study it and either directly or indirectly perceive it with our five senses, it has to be limited to the natural world. So science is absolutely limited to the natural world. Next thing, whether or not science is disprovable. And this is important to bring up. Disprovable is the opposite of these terms right here. So if something is disprovable, it means that it's not certain, it's not rigid or inflexible, and it's not absolute. So obviously, science is disprovable. Our next thing, whether or not science is based on faith or based on belief. Belief, this idea of belief, is the same thing as faith. Science is not based on faith and it's not based on belief. So obviously we're going to put based on belief over on the right-hand side. Here's our next term, democratic. Science is not fair. So science is not democratic. It's not seeking to have everybody's feelings factored into whether or not we should consider it as something that is a truth or not a truth. Here's our next term. Science is or science is not modifiable. Modifiable is the opposite of certain and it's the opposite of rigid. If something is modifiable, it means that it can change. Science changes based on the new data that becomes available. So we do modify science and our understanding of scientific processes in the world based on this new information that we glean. Here's our next one. Science is or science is not based on authority. If the experiment is good and the data that's collected is valid, we could care less about who's actually doing the experimentation. So science is not based on authority. Science doesn't care whether or not you have a background in science. Now, is science or is science not observable? Well, to be able to observe something means that you're using one of your five senses or a combination of your five senses in order to understand what's going on. So obviously science is observable because we know that science is limited based on whether or not you can use one or more of your five senses directly or indirectly. This idea of whether or not science is fair has to do with this idea of whether or not science is democratic. And we've already discussed this. We know that science is not democratic. We don't care about whose feelings are being hurt. The data is the data. Science is indeed not fair because science is not democratic. Science is or science is not debated or decided by debate or law. So if it's based on experimentation and it's also testable, do we care about whether or not people can argue whether or not the science is good or bad? No. Science is driven purely by the data collected through experimentation and through tests. So science is not decided by debate or law. So that's going to go on the right-hand side. Here's our next one. Science is or science is not built upon testable predictions. Now the key word here is testable. And now as scientists, and you guys are going to be doing this a lot this year, you guys are going to be making predictions about what you think will happen. Is science based on or built upon testable predictions? Absolutely. So we're going to see that go on the left-hand side. Now that we've completely populated our list, go ahead and double check, make sure you have everything in the right spot. And when you think you do, you can proceed on to the next activity. Make sure that you study this chart very, very, very carefully because your first quiz of the year is based on whether or not you know what science is or what science is not.